Hey, everybody. Julio Ricardo Varela, founder of Latino Rebels. It is September 22nd, week 2 of Hispanic Heritage Month. And it's also episode 2 of La Historia Uncovered with Julissa Arce. And I am so happy to introduce the next episode, which is hosted by We All Grow Latina, Bese, She Se Puede, and Latino Rebels. So we're very excited, especially given the fact that we are in the 3rd anniversary of Hurricane María. And you know how we roll at Latino Rebels. Puerto Rico is a topic that we love to share. We also love the fact that our host, Julissa, is already calling it a colony and has an amazing guest, one of my favorite intellectual Puerto Ricans, intellectual Boricuas out there, Ed Morales. So I am going to turn it over to Julissa, who will take this show over, and welcome to episode 2. Julissa.
Hi.
Hey.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to have your partnership, and I'm so happy that as soon as I emailed you, said yes, let's do this.
Oh, no, I dove right in. I was like, it's all you. This is yours. It's your mic. I'm going to literally get out of here and watch the live stream with all the rest of our Latino Rebels community. And I'm so excited that you're going to be talking about Puerto Rico's colonial history. And I'm glad you are, because I like to see my fellow peeps talking about Puerto Rico who are asking questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is our 2nd episode of La Historia Uncovered. I just want to take a really quick second to thank our partners, We All Grow Latina, She Se Puede, Bese, and of course, Latino Rebels. I am just so excited that all of you are tuning in and are supporting this project that I really am bringing you from my heart. The inspiration behind the series, for those of you that did not join us last week, is that just over the past few months, I have read a ton of Latinx history books because I am so hungry to learn all the history that we never learned in school. And as I've been doing research for my next book, Rejecting Assimilation, I thought, why not share all of these amazing books that I have read with all of you? So thank you so much for being here. Ed Morales, who is going to be joining us here in just 1 second, is an adjunct professor at Columbia University's Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. He's the author of many books, some of my favorite, including Latinx and Fantasy Island, Colonialism, Exploitation, and the Betrayal of Puerto Rico. Just before I bring Ed on, a very quick note. We really need your help to spread the word about this project. And so if you are watching tonight, I ask that you please live tweet. If you are tweeting, please use the hashtag La Historia Uncovered. If you are posting on Instagram, make sure to tag our partners. My Instagram and Twitter handles are at Julissa Arce, and Ed Morales's Twitter handle is at Spanglish Kid. So Ed, we would like to bring you on now. Twitter handle. Hi, Ed.
Hi.
That was happening to me too, because I was listening to the live thing on my other browser. So it might be on like your YouTube or your Facebook somewhere in like a different window.
Yeah.
It might be on like your YouTube or your Facebook somewhere.
Okay. Maybe I'll just close my other browser.
Yeah, that might be where the noise is coming from.
Okay.
Perfect. There we go.
Thank you.
Well, welcome to La Historia Uncovered. And I'm so happy that you said yes to coming on with us. So thank you for being here. I just want to jump right in because we have so much to cover. I really, 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 really enjoyed reading Fantasy Island. You can see just like the number of notes that I made because there was so much. And one of the, right away in the book, I saw the love and the pain that you feel for Puerto Rico. It really, really comes across on each single page. And in the book, you say that Puerto Rico is your Mecca, the repository of your spiritual self and the endless story of your extended family. So tell me more about what Puerto Rico means to you and what the Nuyorican identity means and why you wanted to tell the history of Puerto Rico today.
Yeah, well, a lot of process in writing the book has to do with my wanting to really reconnect with the island of Puerto Rico. Like when you are like me and you grow up in New York City with Puerto Rican parents, you develop this identity that I'm really proud of. It's bilingual. It incorporates a lot of what goes on in New York. All the different cultures, African American culture, ethnic European culture, and that's really like my default state. But I have a strong feeling for the island, and the island has a kind of a separate culture that doesn't always flow like continuously from the Nuyorican identity. So in the early 2000s, even though I have been writing about Puerto Rico since 1989, I started intensifying my visits back, and I made some friends there, and I was staying there, living there in Santurce and stuff. And I forced myself to just be in conversations all the time in like very thick Puerto Rican Spanish and really understanding what's going on there. And it made a big impact on me and helped me really understand, what it's like to be a local and understand like who's the local politician and where do you go and where do you hang out and what's popular and what people say. Like people said at the time, like, "Hey, que la que?" And and I said, "What the hell is that?" And what they're saying is the "que es lo que hay,"
Right.
And so it was the whole thing that I had to learn, that's really, I think, what really made it possible for me to do the book, because I really started to understand how to communicate with people in Spanish, like with pointing out things that are going on in the local area, and as a journalist, it really helps if you get your subject to trust you, to feel like you really understand them, and it helped me really get deeper into my interviews with people there, and of course, I most importantly really connect with what it means to be Puerto Rican. What is the day-to-day thing about it? My parents, they have this house out in the rainforest, and that was the way I knew the island before. So I had a very visceral understanding of the island, and it also really helped me connect to the fact that like I'm kind of a country boy and a city boy at the same time, because my parents are from the country, and so the Puerto Rican side was really about connecting to the country. But then, as I said, in the early 2000s, I was hanging out in the metro area, so I got into that sensibility too. So, I think it's painful, but more Nuyorican should really try to dive deep into what's going on there and not be afraid when people reject your Spanish and stuff, and just hang with it.
Right. And I see that. I sort of see how there's a conflict between like your Puerto Rican identity and like Nuyorican identity, and how those two are sometimes in conflict, or it felt like sometimes they were in conflict with one another. And I think part of understanding that, and we were talking about this last week when we were talking about the just like the different Latin American countries and how their independence fights kind of helped to shape some of how we experience the United States today. And so I want to take a little bit of a step back, because chapter 1 of your book just really goes into the colonial history of Puerto Rico. And as I mentioned last week, we were talking about the Cuban liberation struggle, and we talked briefly about the Dominican Republic. And so I think part of what I really learned in this book was a deeper understanding of what led to Puerto Rico being robbed of its independence. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us more about that history of why was it that while there was all this Caribbean islands gaining their independence, Puerto Rico was not able to gain its independence at that time?
Yeah. Well, the struggle for independence with Puerto Rico in the late 19th century was intimately connected to Cuba. The leaders of the independence movements in both countries communicated a lot, and the design of each country's flag reflected that period, because one is kind of the inverse of the other. But what happened was that when the U.S. fought the war with Spain, it acquired Cuba and the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and they decided to let Cuba and Philippines go because it was more of a challenge for America or the United States to directly control those places. Particularly, the thing about Cuba is that there were a lot of Black people who organized themselves militarily to fight for independence, and the U.S. was worried that if they continued to control Cuba, that there would be a potential insurgency from those forces. But Puerto Rico was much smaller. It had a less intense independence movement, and the U.S. saw it as a place where it could project its power militarily, because it's the last of the Greater Antilles, and it's sort of like an entryway into the New World, at least by sea. So the U.S. decided to hold on to Puerto Rico, and they eventually made it an unincorporated territory, because they invented the idea of unincorporated territory, because before that, territories that the U.S. acquired were in line to become states. But right from the beginning, particularly if you look at the records of the discussions in Congress about whether Puerto Rico was suitable for a state, they immediately thought like Puerto Ricans were racially inferior, too much black blood, mongrels. There's a prejudice against mixed race people as well as Black people, not as intense, but there is.
Right.
They right from the start, the unincorporated territory was a status that was created that really implied that Puerto Rico would never really be a state, that it would be always in this limbo, that the U.S. would control its economic destiny. But as we were talking earlier in our email, the Jones Act in 1917 was passed, and it made Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens. Some people say it's because they wanted more conscripts for the Army in World War I, but in general, it was kind of a solution to problems that they were having, because Puerto Ricans were trying to come to the U.S. and they had no nationhood, and so there were all these legal problems. They decided to give Puerto Ricans citizenship, but it's a limited citizenship because, as you know, Puerto Ricans can't vote for the president, and they don't pay federal taxes, and
don't have
they have no voting representation.
Yeah,
they do have a representative in Congress, but she can't vote.
Right. Well, one of the things that was interesting about when you brought up the Jones Act, and one of the things that was interesting to read about is that it was 3 years after Puerto Ricans sort of started demanding their independence that then the Jones Act was passed. And I find that interesting, because I feel like even today, in today's society and in today's government, a lot of times we're just kind of given the crumbs or the scraps to sort of say, like, here, how can you say we haven't given you anything? We're like, look, you're now citizens of the United States, right? Like, you can travel to the mainland. Right. And the Jones Act didn't just establish that Puerto Ricans were going to become U.S. citizens, but you were alluding to this, to the United States having economic power and determining the economic situation in Puerto Rico. So what were some of the other things? Because, when I read stories about Puerto Rico, particularly 3 years ago when María hit, there were all this talk about the Jones Act and the Jones Act, and the Jones Act. And I felt like people didn't really even understand what the Jones Act did. Yeah. So what else did the Jones Act do for Puerto Ricans, or more, to say it a better way, what other laws were established for Puerto Ricans during that time?
Well, there were about 3 different acts that were called the Jones Act, and one of them was for the Philippines. The second one, which gave independence, was called the Jones-Shafroth Act. I'm sorry, not independence, citizenship. And but one thing that act did was it said that the bonds that Puerto Rico, and this is important when you get to the debt crisis, would have a triple tax exemption. So if you bought like bonds that were issued by the Puerto Rican government, you would not be taxed federally, locally, or municipally, right? Or I'm sorry, federally, state, or city. Then there was the second Jones Act that applied to Puerto Rico, which is also called the Mercer Marine Act, and that was a lot of regulating commerce between U.S. ports, and so since the ports of Puerto Rico would be technically U.S. ports because it was a territory, it put Puerto Rico under this requirement that all goods transported by water between any U.S. port would have to be ships with the U.S. flag owned by U.S. citizens, and the crew had to also be U.S. citizens, or a percentage, which I forget. So what this does is it takes away international competition for ships that can transport goods to the United States. And most of the research has shown that it causes higher prices. Like the most obvious thing are heavy things, like air conditioners and cars, where people pay quite a bit more for cars and things like that. But there's a lot of stuff that comes in by airplane that is not subject to the same thing, so the price changes and that different. But it does create a burden for the Puerto Rican economy. But I do think that this thing about the bonds and the fact that the U.S. really basically had control over the entire Puerto Rican economy is in some ways more significant, because what happened was the U.S. Sugar companies just came in and divided up all the best lands and expropriated it or bought it out from the local owners. And right then, that was one of the biggest crops. And also they kind of destroyed the coffee industry, because Puerto Rico used to sell a lot of coffee to Cuba, ironically, and Spain, but the U.S. Wasn't interested in that trade, and the U.S. Consumers, and Puerto Rico is still like the fourth largest place for the dumping or selling of U.S. Made products. The U.S. consumers preferred lighter coffee, like from Brazil. So the Puerto Rican coffee industry, which at one point was world famous, was really reduced. But also the control of the sugar industry was really key.
Yeah, that's a sort of another aspect that I really kind of was really eye-opening was that it wasn't just the U.S. government who was inserting economic control, but it was also these corporations, right? And so this sort of extension of the colonial relationship with with Puerto Rico and the U.S., which is not just the U.S. government's colonialism, but corporate colonialism. And and one of the things that you say in your book is that all of these laws really created a model where you say that almost all production in Puerto Rico was steered towards exporting to the U.S. to the point that food and other necessities for local consumption had then to be imported from the United States. And how does that continue to happen today?
Well, yes. One point I wanted to make is that also part of what they were doing was they experimented with this idea of a free trade zone in Puerto Rico. And in many ways, it was kind of a precursor to what happened with the North American Free Trade Act. And similar things are happening with Mexico too, as far as their own agricultural production and consumption of U.S. goods. There was a great book written about that by Elisa Valdez, who teaches at Lehman College, about how how NAFTA has changed eating consumption patterns in Mexico. So it's very similar. With Puerto Rico, what happens is, the U.S. agricultural production then becomes dominant, and the local agricultural production can't compete. So it's basically forcing Puerto Ricans to eat imported food. Is really sometimes hard to get an avocado in Puerto Rico, which is something that grows everywhere, or pineapples. And it's not a great situation in terms of having to pay higher prices. Ironically for stuff, some of my family up in the mountains, they can grow, plátanos and yuca and everything in their own backyards. And it's ridiculous that people who don't have little plots of land have to go to the supermarket and pay inflated prices for stuff that's imported from other parts of the Caribbean or the United States.
Yeah, that's just insane to me that we have to pay higher prices for stuff that is sometimes even grown in our own land, and that it was land that in the first place was like stolen from our ancestors, and it's just kind of insane. One of the other things that I wanted to it's kind of in the same vein that when I think about colonialism, I think that it's sort of like the other side of the racist coin. Like those two things, colonialism and racism, are like attached to one another, because you can't view someone as a subject if you view them as equal, and you can't enslave someone if you view them as human.
Yeah.
In your book, you pointedly write that what happens in Puerto Rico demonstrates the inseparable ties between colonialism and racism. And when I was reading about sort of this invention of, like you said, the Commonwealth and what that even means, and one of the things that really stood out to me is when you say that there was this language of belonging to, so Puerto Rico belonged to the United States, but was not a part of the United States. And when then you move to the conversation about Hurricane Maria, you say that it really comes to a head.
Yeah.
That mentality of it belongs to, but is not a part of. So how did this idea really come to life when Hurricane Maria hit the island?
Yeah. Well, the belonging to but not a part of is from the Downs versus Bidwell, which is these cases called the Insular Cases those were decided before the creation of the Commonwealth, but it's all connected. It was one of the it was a series of Supreme Court rulings that established how the U.S. had a right, or Congress did, to control everything that went on in the territories, and it was basically it was based on that stuff that I was talking about, considering Puerto Ricans racially inferior and therefore not capable of carrying out democracy. And those decisions were ruled on by some of the same Supreme Court judges that ruled on Plessy versus Ferguson. So I talked to a law professor who was in the Second Circuit in Boston, who's Puerto Rican, and his name is Juan Torruella. And he says that Puerto Ricans are separate and not equal, right? Not separate but equal, but separate and not equal. And so that's, that is kind of a precedent for the way that the U.S. Deals with Puerto Rico. It's one of the reasons it came up when they imposed PROMESA, which is the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board that is supposed to restructure the debt. It was challenged, but the Supreme Court decided that Congress could do whatever it wanted to based on these insular cases. But with the hurricane, the Commonwealth was set up, in 1952 because there was a series of nationalist insurrections that happened in the late 40s and early 50s, even before that, and the U.S. was really worried about so many people rebelling and the nationalist movement growing. So what they did was they made being a nationalist sort of illegal, sort of the way that Trump now wants to make New York a anarchist, center that needs to be repressed. For a while you could not, you couldn't display the Puerto Rican flag or sing a nationalist anthem without being subject to fine or arrest. So they created the Commonwealth to create an illusion that Puerto Rico had a semi-autonomous control of their own affairs, And that kind of worked for a while because, you know, they did this Operation Bootstrap, which propped up the economy a little bit and created a small middle class. But all of that, you know, that's kind of like the thesis of my book. This illusion, this fantasy that Puerto Ricans had about having control over their affairs or having a degree of autonomy, it came crashing down around the period of the debt crisis and Hurricane Maria. And it was another Supreme Court decision that happened right around that time that reasserted Congress's control over Puerto Rico. And then, you know, when you had the hurricane, it's just you have the impunity of the Trump administration saying whatever they wanted to about Puerto Rico, and, you know, distributing like 10 times as much money for Houston and Florida, and then really delaying the money. You know, all of that had its roots in, you know, the Insular Cases and basically the treatment by U.S. Congress of Puerto Rico and the territories as being places that, you know, didn't really have a full protection of the Constitution or real autonomous democracy.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, when you were talking about sort of the differences between the U.S. government's reaction to the hurricanes that affected Houston and Texas, and that affects Puerto Rico, and there was just such a disparity. And I mean, one of the things that really just like makes my blood boil is when I see people on Twitter talking about how Trump signed the biggest aid package ever in Puerto Rico. And I'm like, and I learned this from you, which I was like, well, do you actually realize that like $5 billion of that were actually loans and not grants? And so it's like farther indebting the island, which is already in so much debt. And I mean, just this week, right, there was an announcement of new aid to Puerto Rico, but that aid was actually earmarked back in 2018. Right. So how can we better talk about the aid that went to Puerto Ricans during Hurricane Maria in a way that is like truthful?
Right. Well, I mean, you know, what's true about it is that there were several corruption scandals with the money that FEMA was allotting to Puerto Rico. There was firstly the whitefish scandal, where the person who was related to the Secretary of the Interior, got a sweet deal. They had no experience in doing, grid reconstruction, and they got the deal. There was another deal which resulted in the arrest of two FEMA officials who had given another sweetheart deal, another contract there. One part of the money that's Trump authorized is supposed to go to education, and the Secretary of Education, who is an Anglo-American who spoke very good Spanish, who was the Secretary of Education, Julia Kelleher. She was indicted on several charges of fraud, misdirecting a lot of the money that was intended for the educational system into her own accounts. So, it's a classic example of what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism, that there's a natural disaster, and then the government allows, kind of a feeding frenzy for connected corporations. And this might happen again. Now I got a long piece that's coming out in The Nation in a few weeks about the privatization of the electrical authority.
Right. Yeah.
And, a lot of that is also something that's being done, without enough consent by the Puerto Rican people, and suspiciously easy contract awarding, corruption in the review process. So a lot of those details I'm going to be reporting about. That's but the thing is, we can blame Trump for a lot of things, but a lot of these corrupt practices went on under various administrations, Democratic and Republican.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get to that part of the different sort of political parties in Puerto Rico and the island, which are totally different. But I don't want to move too fast through the subject of the debt in Puerto Rico, right? Because that's a huge part of your book
Yeah.
that you talk about. I have it all upside down. That's a huge part of your book that you talk about, is sort of the accumulation of the debt.
Yeah.
And you also write about it in such a way that it made me realize so many things. But one of the things that you say is that the debt in Puerto Rico is framed through racist and classist tropes, because, whether it's the media or politicians, blame the people of Puerto Rico for accumulating the $72 billion of debt. And it certainly is true, as you were very honest about in your book, and even just now, that there is corruption and there has been some mismanagement, but $72 billion were not accumulated purely because of mismanagement. So can you help us to better understand how the colonial and imperialist relationship with the U.S. contributed to the accumulation of the debt in the first place?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of layers to that. I mean, I'll try to be, not go on too long about it, but,
that's why people should read the book, because that's where you learn so much more.
Puerto Rican government has been borrowing to pay off essential services and just pay like government employee salaries since going back as far as the 1970s. I mean, really, the root of the whole problem is that Puerto Rico does not have an independent economy. It's completely, sort of a dumping ground for U.S. goods, and it doesn't create enough wealth because the U.S. does not really create the circumstances for economic development. Like Puerto Rico has one of the lowest GDP to GNP ratios of any nation or municipality. I'm sorry, nation or colony or whatever territory in the world. And what that means is that the percentage of the amount of wealth that it creates compared to the amount that's retained on the island is very low. At one point, it was almost the same as Iraq right after the Iraq invasion, and you know what happened there. So Puerto Rico does not really have an economy that is designed to grow and create opportunities for its people. It's really just about creating profits for U.S. corporations that are invited to come into Puerto Rico with these enormous tax breaks. Now, that's another part of the story.
Right.
They started borrowing in the 70s because of the oil crisis in the U.S. and because the U.S. recession affected Puerto Rico's economy. But going back to you move forward to the 90s, like the Clinton administration decided to get rid of this 936 section in the IRS code. And what that means is it's just a section 936. It's a number of a rule in the IRS code, which allowed U.S. corporations to go to Puerto Rico and not pay any taxes, basically. And so when Clinton decided to cut that out because he was trying to negotiate with these new conservative Republicans who were saying, you got to cut back on tax breaks to corporations because we're not balancing the budget. And so so it was a political move, but it wound up really screwing Puerto Rico because that was kind of the only thing that was keeping some small economic, it was creating small economic growth. So once that stopped, Puerto Rico went into like negative economic growth for like 10 years between 1996 and 2006. And then after that, it's been in complete recession. So that's part of why Puerto Rico had to continue. That's when the debt really took off after 2006. And what happened was that, another thing that I explain is like the global economic system began to depend more and more on speculation on debt. And that's what happened in the 2008 recession. If you remember, it's because they kind of went into this crazy casino-like speculation on debt. And they started packaging together these bad debts. Like, that's another reason why it's racist, because what happened in 2008 or in the years leading up to it is that they lent a lot of money to people of color who they knew could not pay the debt back on the house. But they used it as a tool to speculate on it. So some people would bet for that people could pay back, and some people would bet that they couldn't pay it back, and some people were betting on both sides. So it was a crazy thing, and the whole system fell apart, and that's why there was a crash in 2008. So then after that, these people who speculated on debt, they started going to other places like Argentina and Greece. So what happened is these vulture funds, right, which are hedge funds on steroids, that they specialize in investing in countries that are doing really badly. What they do is they buy their debt at really low prices, and then they are depending on court decisions so that they can recoup the entire amount of the debt. So in other words, I'm betting that you can't pay your student loan for $45,000. I'm going to buy your student loan for $10,000, and then when you get taken to court, I'm going to get the whole $45,000, and then I make $35,000. And so this is something that, you know, Puerto Rico became part of this Wall Street game. And unfortunately, you know, I mean, Puerto Rico was just trying to, you know, both administrations were guilty in being led astray or knowing that it was all kind of a game and sort of profiting on the side. But it's essentially a global finance, Wall Street driven deal, you know, that knew that Puerto Rico, you know, in the book I talk about how the credit rating system, you know, how could they actually rate these bonds as something that's worth something when Puerto Rico had shown no economic growth for years. There was no prospect of economic recovery in Puerto Rico, but still they were selling these bonds, you know, and so it was ridiculous.
Yeah. Sometimes I just feel so, I think you know that I worked on Wall Street for 10 years, and I was there during the financial crisis. I was not directly doing mortgages,
but I forgot about that detail.
But I was there, and reading your book, I was really, I really just confronted with the fact that whether or not I was directly working on these bonds or on these deals, I was working there, and I was part of that environment. And I actually remember the very first time I went to Puerto Rico, I went there for a meeting, and it was a financial meeting that I went there to go, you know, sell some financial products. And I landed on the island, went to a lunch for an hour, went back to the airport, went back to New York. I hadn't thought about that trip until I read your book. And I thought, wow, you know, like that, like I was part of that problem. I mean, it's not all on me.
Well, we're all part of the problem.
But I was there.
Nobody stopped this from happening.
Yeah.
We had the chance to stop everything, but we didn't.
Yeah, but sort of just really understanding. You know, now I really have a deeper understanding of when Puerto Ricans say this debt is illegal. And we need to, a lot of the debt needs to be forgiven. Now I understand what it really means and where it's coming from. And that it's not just this, like, it's not just rhetoric. It's not just Puerto Ricans sort of saying, we need to get rid of this debt. Like, there's actual real reasons behind it. And so I thank you for helping me sort of just like understand that. I just want to make a quick note. I have a couple of more questions, but then we are going to be opening it up to the audience for questions. So if you do have a question, just sort of start thinking about what that question is, and then I'll cue you when to enter that question, because I'm so glad that there's a lot of comments coming through. But what that means then is that if you've already posted a question, I have not seen it. So I will ask you to repost that question again once we get to that part of it. I wanted to shift gears just a tiny little bit to, this past week, it was reported that migrant women at a detention center in Georgia were being forcibly sterilized against their will. And this is an issue that Puerto Ricans are very familiar with. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of eugenics, how the history of eugenics has played out on the women of Puerto Rico?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the middle part of the 20th century, Margaret Sanger, who, is also at the forefront of a lot of the efforts to distribute birth control to women, we shouldn't forget that was a positive thing, had, pushed some of the birth control companies to go to Puerto Rico and explore what was going on there. And there at times a eugenicist agenda was imposed on Puerto Rico. There's a lot of gray area about which women were sterilized carelessly and some who maybe weren't. But really, a really large percentage of Puerto Rican women were sterilized in about a 30 or 40-year period. Another thing happened too is that women were used as guinea pigs. This is another thing that is not necessarily about sterilization, but a lot of women were used as guinea pigs to test birth control pills, and that had a lot of negative effect on women. There's a great documentary called La Operación that I think you can see on YouTube that really describes the story in very compelling detail. But I mean, this is something also that's happened, to African American communities in the South. There's something that came out about women in prison in California this morning. I was listening to, and so. Yes, it's it's a horrendous but it shows that the power is not only about race discrimination. It's about patriarchy and control over women's bodies and exploitation and abuse of women, and also violence against women, which is something that is too often brushed over.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what gets lost. The reason I wanted to have these conversations and do this La Historia Uncovered series is because so much of the history of our collective people has been lost. And so then things like what's happening at the Georgia Detention Center happen, and we view them as isolated events, when in reality, it's just another chapter and a continuation of the way in which we have been treated, Black and brown people and immigrants have been treated in this country. You mentioned, some of the other places it's happened. I mean, just here in Los Angeles, where I live now, in 1975, there were women who were Spanish-speaking women who were being sterilized, and they were signing away things they didn't know they were signing because they were in English and they had just given birth. And so it's important to learn this history because otherwise, we sort of view these things as isolated when they are not. And I love this quote that you put in your book from Albizu. Am I saying his name correctly?
Yeah.
Albizu Campos,
yeah.
Who said that Puerto Rico will be sovereign and independent when Puerto Rican women feel free, feel sovereign, feel independent.
Yeah.
And that just makes me a little emotional, because I think that's absolutely true. And I think, even if you remove Puerto Rican and you just say like the world will be sovereign and independent, and it's so true. I have just one more question before I open it up to Q&A, and I did promise that I was going to do better this time about giving people more time to ask questions, because last week I was so ingrained in the conversation that I lost track of time. So one, and this might not be such a short answer, but hopefully, we can get through it and get some questions. Your book really opened my eyes to a mistake that I have made, which is to call for Puerto Rico. Sometimes I don't know if I want to say Puerto Rico or Puerto Rico, and then I get stuck in the middle. But I've sort of like gotten on the bandwagon of calling for Puerto Rico to become a state, thinking that that's what's going to get some equality for Puerto Ricans. And then reading your book really made me realize that, in fact, many Puerto Ricans do not want to be they do not want Puerto Rico to be a state. And I wonder if that's because if Puerto Rico was to become a state, the dream of independence that really is in the national identity of Puerto Ricans would disappear. That would no longer be possible. And then what do you see as the future for Puerto Rico?
Well, look, the support for statehood has a long and interesting history, which is hard to sum up. There was one of the the big leaders for statehood in the early history of Puerto Rico, Barbosa, was an Afro-Puerto Rican who felt that he would prefer statehood because, like, the local elite was more tied to the Spanish colonialism and might discriminate against him. There have been proposals, like a colleague of mine at Columbia was involved in this radical statehood proposal in the 1990s that talked about why not become a state, because Puerto Ricans would have more power than than just having a representative at the UN. They'd have representatives in Congress, and Puerto Ricans would be more able to be involved with progressive and radical movements in the US by having more access to them. But the problem is, like, national identity is, like, really strong, and the Spanish language is really strong, and the Puerto Rican culture and traditions are really strong. And a lot of times I fall on the side of that emotionally. I feel tied to that. And then, actually at this point that we're in now, it's become more and more obvious, that the U.S. has really mistreated and exploited Puerto Rico. And actually now with this president, it's really less appealing to want to be part of the United States, because the actions of the United States are just becoming more and more reprehensible around the world. So I think a lot of people are looking at it that way. But I do think that most of all, the fact that Puerto Rico was a colony under Spain for 400 years. Spain was in the process of granting Puerto Rico a limited autonomy in which they would actually have votes in the Spanish Parliament, if they had remained with Spain, which is better than anything that the U.S. has ever offered. And so the sadness of almost being autonomous, really on the path to independence, compared to the absolute subjection, really, of the Puerto Rican people to U.S. control for the last 120 some odd years, I think really makes a lot of Puerto Ricans not want to choose the option of statehood. But if you really look at what's going on in Puerto Rico itself, statehood has a lot of supporters, and they're on both sides. I mean, some are Republicans and other are Democrats. Sometimes the statehood movement is really allied to the same kind of reactionary right-wing forces of Trumpism. Several of the main statehood party politicians in Puerto Rico are in favor of Trump. But
which I cannot understand, but
citizenship as security. What I favor really is, it's kind of a very strident position, which is independence with reparations.
Yeah.
Using the legal justification that the U.S. did never allow Puerto Rico to become a state because of racial discrimination, and has pretty much prevented any kind of developing economy in Puerto Rico for all this time. So that really adds up to quite a bit of money. And I wouldn't want independence without I think that Puerto Rico to be cast off into the global economy,
right, after the way that's been.
Right. It's no, I think if there was a moral argument, that I think that independence with reparations is what I would favor.
Yeah, and we are going to open it up to question and answer now. So if you do have a question, I have not been keeping up with the comments because I'm in the conversation. So if you do have a question, the time to post it is now, and we'll pick some of the questions. There are a lot of questions, which I'm glad to see. One of the, just while the questions are coming in, I just wanted to say that in sort of this concept of reparations, I was reading that when Haiti became independent from the French were demanding that Haiti pay them $150 million or francs, or I don't remember the sum of money, but that Haiti should pay them because of the slaves that they were now losing. And so that same logic should apply now, that if we had to pay when we became independent nations, that now the United States and other colonial places should pay us for everything they took from us, from the land they took from us, from the labor they stole from us. So I think that it, is, to me, it's not even just like a moral argument, which it is, but it's also a practical one. Okay, so here is a question. What is an action an everyday Latina like me can take to support Puerto Rico, dismantle further information, push policy change with my representatives? So what can people do to stand up for Puerto Rico and to stand in solidarity?
Yeah, well, Julissa, if you're out there out west, there's a Representative Raul Grijalva from Arizona who is the head of the Natural Resources Committee that actually has proposed legislation to change some things about the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board, which we didn't talk about that much. He wants the U.S. to pay for, Puerto Rico government itself pays like millions of dollars for this board that is, controls everything about the economy. And he also wants a new audit, a debt audit. So a lot of organizations that are affiliated with the Democratic Party support this plan, but I think that it should go. I think that people should advocate for debt forgiveness for Puerto Rico. I mean, if you're willing to advocate for debt forgiveness for student loans and other things like that, I mean, Puerto Rico, needs, top economists from Columbia University say that 90 to 95% of the debt should be eliminated for any chance for economic development. So I think that's really the main thing. And if you can see what the government has done, both the Republicans and Democrats have been screaming about balancing the budget and they don't want to spend too much money. And then with the COVID crisis, they suddenly came out with trillions of dollars. So, where'd that come from? I mean, that would pay for Puerto Rico's debt. So I think that canceling the debt is really, to advocate for that is, strong thing you can do for Puerto Rico.
Yeah, thank you. And I will just say that, another thing you can do just to support this work is to buy Ed's book, Fantasy Island. We've posted a link on the chat where you can buy it from our indie book partner, Creating Conversations. So you are supporting the author and supporting local bookstores. So we can take another question. Here it is. I haven't had the chance to read your book, but adding it to my list. I call Puerto Rico my happy place. Want to learn more other books that you would recommend?
Yeah, there's a book on Haymarket Press that's edited by a colleague of mine, Yarimar Bonilla and Marisol Lebron. That's called Aftershocks. I forget the subtitle. I actually have a chapter in the book about, just part of the debt crisis, but most of the book is not about economic things. There's a lot of poetry. There's a lot of political essays. There's a lot about the people who are making art, community movements, a lot of the, a focus on women. So that's a great book. Another book that I like is called Puerto Rico in the American Century by Ayala and Bernabe, these two professors. And then if you're curious, Nelson Dennis has a book called War on All Puerto Ricans, which is a little controversial because it bends the truth a little bit about history, but it's kind of an exciting read. And it makes clear good guys and bad guys, when we talk about with the situation in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, thank you for those recommendations. And also in the back of your book, you have notes. And so there's a lot of books that you read in your research for the book. Yeah. So there's also a lot of other books you can read from notes. One of the, and I don't know if it was sort of a short question that I saw before, which was asking for clarification whether or not Puerto Ricans could vote. And so that is an important thing because Puerto Ricans who live on the island cannot vote in presidential elections.
Right.
But if a Puerto Rican then moves to one of the 50 states and they establish residency in one of the 50 states, then they are able to vote for the presidential election. Did I get it right?
Yeah, it's true. Once you move to the mainland, you live pretty much as a regular American citizen. And I got to say that Puerto Ricans really kind of take that for granted, because one thing that I've experienced, by interacting with my Latino brother and sister is, the precarity of like trying to get citizenship and not being a citizen, and we really take that for granted. Luis Gutierrez, who was a representative from Chicago, I'm really proud of him because he was Puerto Rican, but he was one of the leaders for immigration reform, and he had a large Mexican and Mexican American constituency in Chicago.
Yeah, that's good. That's good clarification. I don't know if we have any more questions from the audience, but I've just had such an amazing time talking to you, and I know we've had a conversation before, just even about your previous book, Latinx, and sort of that term, and it feels like more and more people are having conversations about what the term means, and so I really hope that I would really hope that you can come back to La Historia Uncovered.
I'd love to.
We need to have just a conversation about the word Latinx, how Latinos identify themselves, how we should identify ourselves, because that's an important conversation. So I hope that you will come back. It seems like we've answered a lot of the questions that people had, and so
nobody wants to talk about Bad Bunny.
Oh my God! Can we talk about Bad Bunny? And can we talk about this concert?
Yeah.
Wow, this concert
he went right all through the Bronx. Yeah, my friend saw him out the window. Yeah.
That's amazing. So yeah, so let's end the interview before I give my little closing remarks. Talking about Bad Bunny, what is the impact that Bad Bunny has had on Puerto Rico, for Puerto Ricans? What is his impact? Because I mean, I just think he's been such an amazing. He's not just an amazing artist, but also just like an amazing advocate. So, what has been Bad Bunny's impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's shown that reggaeton can be done in a different way, adding like elements of performance art to it. He's tried to shatter gender normativity, by making some changes in his appearance that reflect his feminine side. But he showed up at the Ricky Renuncia protests in 2019. And I think what he did, like with his concert, I mean, I was really happy about it, because he could have just tried to do like standing on a top of a truck in right. Times Square. They would have easily, or Brooklyn or something, like U2 playing the Brooklyn Bridge. But he chose to go through different hoods. He went through the South Bronx, which is very Puerto Rican and Dominican. Then he went through Washington Heights, was the capital of Dominican Republic in New York. And then when he was coming downtown, he made a left on 125th Street and he stayed uptown. And I think that was a great symbolism and signaling of Bad Bunny really understanding who the community is. I don't know whether he decided it himself or he was advised, but I think everybody reacted really strongly to it. Yeah,
absolutely. And I will always consider myself a New Yorker, because I lived there for 10 years. So I feel like I met the minimum threshold to be able to call myself a New Yorker. And you got it. Right. So so it was amazing just to see him, and then to kind of see New York, and particularly after everything New York has been through with COVID. And so, and for him to end it in front of a hospital and kind of just tip his hat for essential workers was just all around amazing. Well, this concludes our episode of La Historia Uncovered, episode 2. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but that just really goes to show how much more there is for us to talk about and for us to learn from. So thank you so much, Ed, for being with us. Thank you again to all of our partners. I just want to give a huge thank you to Ana Flores from We All Grow Latina. This would not be happening without her and without her partnership. Thank you so much to Julio from Latino Rebels and for your partnership. And just lastly, I want to encourage you to please share about La Historia Uncovered. The episode will be available on YouTube and on We All Grow Latinas and Latino Rebels Facebook page. So please make sure to share it. Next week, we will be speaking with Laura Gomez, who wrote a book called Inventing Latinos, and her other book, Manifest Destinies, Making of the Mexican American Race. And, a lot of times, and in particular in this time, we're talking a lot about how Latinos are an ethnicity and not a race. And the argument, the very compelling argument she makes in her books, is that Latinos should be considered a race because we are already racialized. So a little bit of controversial topic, but I think one that people will really enjoy. And so thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Julissa.
Bye, Ed.